Three daughters vanished from society in the summer of 1852. Their father, one of the wealthiest men in Georgia, told neighbors that his girls had fallen ill and required complete isolation. For 11 long months, no one saw them. When a new sheriff arrived in the county and started asking questions, he uncovered something that made even the most hardened lawmen sick to their stomachs. What Edmund Rutled had done to his own daughters, under the guise of preserving his family's legacy, would become one of the most disturbing and unforgettable cases in Georgia's history. It was a calculated experiment built on deception, cruelty, and a web of corruption that reached all the way to the state capitol. But before we continue the story of Edmund Rutled and what really happened behind the locked doors of Clearwater Plantation, I need you to do one thing. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because stories like this, true stories that history tried to bury, don't get told nearly enough. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're watching from. I want to know where my audience is, because every region hides its own buried secrets, and your comments help me decide which ones to uncover next. Now, let's step back to where this nightmare truly began, inside a hotel ballroom in Atlanta, where ambitious men gather to discuss the future of Southern agriculture. The seeds of horror are often planted in places that seem completely respectable. The spring of 1852 brought strange, unseasonable rain to central Georgia, turning red clay roads into rivers of mud and delaying cotton planting by almost 3 weeks. For most planters, that meant long nights filled with worry and endless financial calculations. But for Edmund Rutled, it meant an opportunity, a chance to travel to Atlanta for the Southern Agricultural Convention, an annual gathering where plantation owners, agricultural scientists, and businessmen met to discuss new innovations in farming, crop rotation, and labor management. Edmund had built his fortune through ambition, not inheritance. Unlike many plantation aristocrats who'd received their wealth through family lineage, he had started with a modest cotton farm left to him by a distant uncle and transformed it into one of the most profitable enterprises in Hancock County. By 1852, his plantation, called Clearwater for spring-fed creek running along its eastern boundary, sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres and housed 87 enslaved workers. His cotton sold at premium prices in Savannah. His credit was solid at every bank between Augusta and Milledgeville, and his name carried real weight in the state legislature, where he had served 2 terms before declining a third to focus on his agricultural ambitions. He was 46 years old that spring, a widower of 3 years. His wife, and had died of consumption during the cold winter of 1849, leaving him with 3 daughters and no male heir. That absence haunted him. Under Georgia law, his estate would be divided among his daughters after his death, likely breaking apart within a generation as they married and their husbands claimed their shares. The Rutled name would disappear, absorbed into other families and forgotten in time. Catherine, the eldest at 22, had inherited her mother's quiet dignity and love of literature. She spent hours in plantation library reading novels her father considered frivolous but tolerated nonetheless. Margaret, at 20, shared her father's keen mind for numbers and often helped review plantation accounts, showing an almost masculine aptitude for business that both impressed and unsettled him. Elizabeth, barely 18, was the artist of the family. She painted the Georgia countryside in watercolor, setting her easel near the creek on bright afternoons. All 3 daughters had received an education rare for Southern women: French, mathematics, history, and music. Edmund had hired a tutor from Charleston who lived in a small cottage on property and gave daily lessons. In Edmund's mind, their education served a greater purpose than mere refinement. He was preparing them for strategic marriages, to men who could expand his influence, strengthen his business connections, and perhaps even unite nearby plantations through alliances. But what Edmund heard at the convention in Atlanta would change his thinking forever. The Grand Hotel's ballroom glimmered with chandeliers on the evening of April 23, 1852. Nearly 200 men in black suits filled the hall, their conversations a low rumble mixed with the clink of whiskey glasses and bursts of laughter. Edmund stood near the refreshment table, half listening to talk about new cotton gins when a voice from the speaker's podium cut through the noise. "Gentlemen, if I may have your attention," the announcer said. "Our next speaker comes from the College of Charleston, where he's been studying the emerging science of heredity and its applications to agricultural breeding." The man who took the stage was Dr. Nathaniel Peton, a thin figure with wire-rimmed spectacles and a nervous energy that bordered on mania. For the next 40 minutes, he lectured passionately on ideas he had learned from European scientists, concepts about bloodlines, inherited traits, and selective breeding. He spoke of cattle and horses, explaining how careful pairing produced stronger offspring, more obedient workers, and more efficient animals. "The same principles that govern livestock," Dr. Peton declared, his voice rising with conviction, "apply equally to all of God's creatures. Strength breeds strength. Intelligence breeds intelligence. A farmer who understands these laws can transform his entire operation within a single generation." Edmund listened, his interest sharpening with every word. Around him, some men nodded thoughtfully, while others shifted uncomfortably. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. Everyone in that room understood exactly what all of God's creatures truly meant. After the lecture, Edmund approached Dr. Peton at the bar. They spoke for more than an hour, Edmund asking careful, deliberate questions about hereditary traits, about the science of selection, about real-world results. Flattered by the attention and loosened by bourbon, Peton revealed more than he should have. He spoke of plantation owners in South Carolina who were experimenting with selective pairing among enslaved workers to breed stronger, more resilient laborers. He even mentioned one planter near Charleston who had over 15 years, had created what he proudly called a specialized workforce, the result of carefully controlled breeding programs. "The key," Peton said, leaning closer, his breath thick with whiskey, "is controlling every variable. You cannot leave such matters to chance or random coupling. You must think like a scientist, like a horse breeder. Identify your finest specimens and create deliberate combinations." Edmund absorbed every word. His mind was already racing, calculating, planning, envisioning. But Peton's next statement struck him with particular force. "Of course," the doctor continued, "the ultimate experiment would involve cross-bloodline breeding. Some call it hybrid vigor, combining distinct lines to capture the best traits of each. Theoretically, it could produce extraordinary results, though such an experiment would require the utmost discretion." Edmund understood immediately. The idea began to take root, bold, monstrous, and irresistible. He returned to Clearwater on April 27th, his mind consumed by possibilities. The spring rains had finally ended, and his workers were now laboring in extended shifts to make up for lost time. Riding through the fields on his gray mare, Edmund observed the scene with new eyes, evaluating each enslaved worker not only for current productivity, but for what he now saw as their potential contribution to something far greater. His gaze fixed on one man in particular, Samuel. Samuel stood 6'3", unusually tall for any man of that era. 31 years old, born on the Rutled Plantation, the son of workers Edmund's uncle had purchased back in 1819. Unlike most enslaved men who were deliberately kept illiterate, Samuel had somehow learned to read. Edmund suspected his mother had taught him, having once worked in the main house, and perhaps picked up letters from discarded newspapers. Samuel never flaunted his knowledge. He gave Edmund no cause to punish him. But on more than one occasion, Edmund had seen him reading the printed notices posted in the plantation's yard, his eyes moving across the words with calm, unmistakable comprehension. Beyond literacy, Samuel possessed a rare practical intelligence. He seemed to understand the land itself, predicting weather shifts with uncanny accuracy, instinctively practicing crop rotation, even redesigning the plantation's irrigation system to capture more water from the creek. He worked with steady precision, never lazy, never frantic, just efficient and disciplined. There was something self-contained about him, a quiet dignity that Edmund found both valuable and vaguely threatening. Samuel was also unmarried, a deliberate decision on Edmund's part. While most planners encouraged slave marriages to grow their workforce naturally, Edmund had kept Samuel separate, sensing that his worth lay in his uniqueness rather than in producing ordinary offspring with ordinary women. Now, as Edmund watched Samuel labor under the Georgia sun, he saw him differently. He didn't see a man, he saw potential. He saw the key to ensuring the Rutled name would never die. The plan took shape over the following weeks. Edmund spent long nights locked in his study, scratching notes and calculations into a leather-bound journal hidden in a false compartment of his desk. He wasn't writing about cotton yields or market prices. He was designing something new, something monstrous, a systematic breeding program that would tie his daughter's bloodline to the plantation itself, binding their descendants to Clearwater forever. The result would be a population of mixed-race laborers who could belong neither to white nor black society, trapped by law and lineage alike. They would have no choice but to remain. In Edmund's mind, the genius of the plan lay in its permanence. His future grandchildren would carry Rutled blood, but without legal rights of inheritance. They would be bound to the estate by biology, yet excluded by law. They would never be able to claim the land, but could never leave it either. He would control them absolutely, generation after generation. And in his twisted logic, he imagined them to be stronger, sharper, more obedient, a blend of Samuel's intelligence and physical strength fused with Rutled lineage. But such a plan required more than secrecy. It demanded justification, a way to protect himself from scandal, to cloak the experiment in legal safety and moral ambiguity. For that, Edmund needed influence. He needed allies. On May 15th, he invited Judge Horace Ketchum to dinner at Clearwater. Ketchum was 71 years old, a fixture of Hancock County's courts for over 4 decades. He presided over property disputes, inheritance battles, criminal trials, and he'd become wealthy doing it. His fortune built from quiet partnerships in several plantations, including Edmund's own. The judge had no wife, no children, no heirs. His loyalties lay only with those who served his financial interests. That evening, they dined on roasted duck and potatoes, served by silent house servants moving to the long mahogany dining room. Edmund waited until after dinner, when they retired to his study with brandy, before revealing his idea. He presented it carefully, disguised as a legal question rather than a confession. "Judge," Edmund began, swirling his glass, "I've been studying recent cases involving mixed blood inheritance. Curious legal territory, wouldn't you say?" Ketchum raised an eyebrow, his tone measured. "Curious, indeed, though quite settled. Mixed blood children have no legal standing to inherit property from white parents. The law is very clear on that." "Precisely," Edmund replied, leaning forward, "which presents a unique opportunity. Imagine a man producing heirs who have no legal claim to his estate, yet remain tied to it by blood. A permanent workforce, bound to the land, unable to leave, unable to divide it through marriage or sale." Ketchum's expression shifted slightly as understanding dawned. "You're speaking theoretically, of course," he said. "Of course," Edmund replied smoothly. "But if such an arrangement were to exist, hypothetically, would the law protect it? Would those involved be shielded from prosecution or public consequence?" The judge was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fireplace as he considered. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, deliberate. "Georgia law prohibits miscegenation, sexual relations between whites and Negroes," he said. "However, prosecution requires evidence, witnesses, and most importantly, a willing plaintiff. If such an arrangement were conducted privately, within one's own property, and no external complaint were raised, and if certain precautions were taken in how the matter was recorded, then legally speaking, there would be no crime to prosecute." Edmund leaned forward. "What sort of precautions?" "A paper trail," the judge replied calmly. suggesting something other than willing participation by the white parties. Documents indicating coercion by the Negro Party, perhaps sworn statements describing an attack or an assault that led to unfortunate consequences. Such documentation would protect the reputation of any white women involved and, if ever questioned, would criminalize a Negro. Edmund's pulse quickened. The judge was laying out a legal framework for his plan, and if the Negro in question were promised freedom in exchange for his cooperation, Edmund asked. Ketchum's smile was thin, his eyes sharp. Promises made to slaves carry no legal weight. They may be honored or broken entirely at the master's discretion. A wise man might offer such promises to ensure obedience, then revoke them once the work is done. The slave would have no recourse whatsoever. They spoke for another hour, Edmund revealing more of his idea in cautious detail, and Ketchum advising on legal protections and documentation strategies. By the time the judge left Clearwater that night, Edmund had gained more than advice. He had gained a co-conspirator, someone with the legal power to shield the experiment from any threat of interference. But Edmund needed more than legal protection. He needed medical validation, a doctor who could provide official documentation, certify the health of participants, and support whatever narrative he chose to tell. He needed someone obedient, discreet, and desperate enough not to ask questions. Dr. Leonard Strickland had served as Clearwater's plantation physician for 6 years. Edmund had hired him from Augusta after the previous doctor died of typhoid. Strickland was 42, competent in his trade, unremarkable in every other way, and deeply in debt. Through quiet investigation, Edmund had learned that Strickland's gambling habits and bad investments had left him owing large sums to several creditors in Milledgeville. On May 22nd, Edmund summoned Strickland to Clearwater under the pretense of reviewing the health of his enslaved workers. After the doctor completed several examinations in the overseer's quarters, Edmund invited him to the main house for lunch. At first, their conversation was harmless, routine medical topics. Recent cases of dysentery, the use of quinine for fever, the common injuries suffered by field hands. Then Edmund shifted the discussion to something far more delicate. Doctor, he began smoothly, I have a proposition that may interest you, one that could substantially improve your financial situation. Strickland's expression tensed. I'm listening. Edmund explained that he was preparing what he called a breeding program to improve his workforce. Carefully selected pairings designed to produce stronger, more intelligent laborers. He would need medical documentation throughout, health examinations, pregnancy monitoring, birth records. In return, Edmund offered him an additional $500 a year beyond his regular fee, a fortune for a rural physician, in exchange for total discretion and absolute cooperation. Strickland listened in uneasy silence, his discomfort plain. You're talking about arranged pairings among your slaves? Among others, Edmund said carefully. The program will include my daughters. The silence that followed was suffocating. Strickland set down his fork, his face pale and rigid. Mr. Rutled, what you're suggesting? I'm suggesting nothing illegal, Edmund interrupted firmly. I'm proposing a carefully monitored program to produce healthy offspring, children who will remain on this plantation permanently. You will document everything exactly as instructed. In return, your debts will be erased by the end of the year. You will continue receiving generous compensation, and you will never speak of this to anyone. Strickland's hands trembled. He was trapped, and both men knew it. The debts were crushing him, and Edmund's offer represented not only relief but survival. What about your daughters? Strickland asked quietly. Do they know any of this? That, Edmund replied coldly, is my concern, not yours. Your concern is providing medical care and documentation. Nothing more. 3 days later, Strickland sent word confirming his agreement. Edmund now had everything he needed: his legal shield and his medical accomplice. The foundation of his experiment was complete. All that remained was to inform his daughters of their roles. He chose a Sunday evening in early June. Summer had come with oppressive heat, and even with the windows open, the parlor felt suffocating. Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth sat together on the velvet settee, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Their father rarely called family meetings, and when he did, it was never for trivial reasons. Edmund stood before the empty fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture they recognized from childhood. The stance he took when delivering decrees that allowed no debate. "I've made decisions regarding the future of this family," he began. "Decisions that will ensure the Rutled name and this plantation endure for generations to come." The sisters exchanged uncertain glances. Elizabeth, the youngest, folded her hands tightly in her lap, her face pale with nervous anticipation. Edmund continued, his tone steady, commanding, "You know that I have no sons, no male heirs to inherit Clearwater. Under current law, when I die, this estate will be divided among you. Through your marriages, it will fragment, scattered into other families, other names. The Rutled legacy will vanish within a generation." "Father," Catherine said softly, "we understand your concern, but surely there are arrangements." "I have found solution," Edmund interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "A way to create heirs who will be permanently bound to this land, who will never claim ownership, yet never be able to leave. A workforce of exceptional quality, combining the finest aspects of our bloodline with carefully chosen traits from our labor force." The room fell into stunned silence. Margaret was the first to grasp what he meant, her face draining of color. "Father, what exactly are you proposing?" she whispered. Edmund laid it out with the cold precision of a business plan. Each daughter would bear children by Samuel, his strongest and most intelligent slave. Those children would be raised at Clearwater, educated enough to manage the plantation's operations, yet kept in permanent servitude. They would form the core of a new generation, an unbreakable, self-sustaining labor force that could never be sold, never be freed, and never leave. They would never be sold away or lost to marriage. Edmund's daughters would be cared for throughout their pregnancies, attended by Dr. Strickland, and afterward would return to their ordinary lives. The children would be raised primarily by enslaved nursemaids, while the daughters maintained whatever level of maternal involvement they wished. "This is madness," Catherine whispered. "You can't possibly." "I can and I will," Edmund said flatly. "You will cooperate with this plan, or you will find yourselves without a home, without inheritance, without any means of support. I will remove you from my will entirely, and you will be sent away with nothing. No respectable family will take you, and once I reveal your disobedience." Elizabeth began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. Margaret sat rigid, her jaw clenched tight. Catherine stared at her father as if seeing him for the first time, recognizing a stranger behind familiar features. "What about Samuel?" Margaret asked, her voice hollow. "Does he have any choice in this?" Edmund's expression hardened. "Samuel is my property," he said coldly. "He will do as I command. He will be promised his freedom and land of his own once the children are born and weaned. I suspect that promise will ensure his cooperation." "You're lying to him," Margaret said bitterly. "You have no intention of freeing him." Edmund didn't deny it. "What I promise a slave is my concern. Your concern is fulfilling your duty to this family." The meeting dragged on for another hour. Catherine appealing to reason, Margaret making veiled threats to inform the authorities, and Elizabeth doing nothing but weeping quietly. Edmund countered every objection with cold, calculated logic and unyielding ultimatums. He had anticipated every argument, prepared every response. He reminded them that they were unmarried women with no means of their own, that their reputations would be destroyed if they defied him, and that no court in Georgia would side with daughters over their father, especially one of the standing. Finally, he delivered his closing decree. "You have 1 week to accept this plan willingly," he said. "If you refuse, I will declare all 3 of you mentally incompetent and have Judge Ketchum commit you to the state asylum in Milledgeville, where you will spend the rest of your lives. I have already discussed this with him, and he has assured me the paperwork can be completed in a single day." With that, he left them in the parlor, their futures decided, their agency stripped away. The following morning, Edmund summoned Samuel to his study. Samuel entered cautiously, as any enslaved man would when called before his master. He stood near the door, posture respectful but not servile, waiting. "Sit," Edmund said, gesturing toward a chair. Samuel obeyed, confusion flickering in his eyes. Slaves were never invited to sit in the master's study. "I have a proposition for you," Edmund began. "One that could secure your freedom and your future." Over the next 30 minutes, Edmund carefully laid out his plan, laced with strategic omissions and deliberate lies. He told Samuel that his daughters needed to bear children to preserve the family legacy, but that he wanted those children to possess exceptional qualities: intelligence, strength, resilience. He told Samuel he had been chosen because he was the finest worker on the plantation, a man of keen mind and strong character. And in exchange for his participation, Edmund promised that once the children were born, Samuel would receive his freedom papers, 20 acres of farmland near the Tennessee border, and $500 to begin his new life. Samuel listened in stunned silence. The offer sounded impossible, too generous to be true, yet Edmund's face showed nothing but solemn sincerity. "Why me?" Samuel finally asked. "Because you're exceptional," Edmund replied, "and because I want my grandchildren to be exceptional. You'll be treated well during the entire process. You'll have better quarters, better food, and when it's all done, you'll be a free man with land of your own. Everything will be documented legally." Samuel's thoughts spun wildly. Freedom, land, a life beyond bondage. The offer pulled at him with an almost painful hope, though doubt lingered in the corners of his mind. Why would a man like Edmund Rutled truly free his most valuable slave? "What about your daughters?" Samuel asked carefully. "Do they agree to this?" "They understand their duty to the family," Edmund said smoothly, the lie so polished it sounded like truth. "They are willing participants in securing the Rutled future." Samuel wanted to believe him. The alternative, that Edmund would force such an arrangement, was too monstrous to imagine, even for a slave master. And the promise of freedom burned so brightly, it blinded him to caution. "If I refuse?" Samuel asked quietly. Edmund's expression darkened. "Then I'll sell you to a rice plantation on the coast," he said. "You'll work waist-deep in fever-ridden swamps until malaria or exhaustion kills you. That usually takes less than 5 years." It wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. Samuel nodded slowly. "I'll do it." Edmund smiled faintly and produced a document, a kind of contract, though legally meaningless, since slaves could not sign agreements. It detailed all of Edmund's promises: freedom, land, money. Samuel signed his name in careful, practiced letters. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Edmund had already prepared a second set of papers, documents that would declare Samuel a fugitive if he ever tried to leave Clearwater, papers that accused him of assaulting the Rutled daughters, painting him not as a participant, but as a violent criminal. Judge Ketchum had already signed them, post-dated, and ready to be filed the moment Samuel became inconvenient. The trap was complete, a snare woven from lies and legal manipulation, ready to spring shut on everyone involved. On June 14, 1852, Dr. Strickland arrived at Clearwater to conduct what he called preliminary health examinations. He met privately with each daughter, performing his duties with cold professionalism, his eyes carefully avoiding theirs. Catherine sat in silence, her face composed but icy. Margaret asked pointedly whether he felt any moral conflict about his role in this arrangement. Questions Strickland dodged behind a wall of medical jargon. Elizabeth cried softly throughout the examination. When he was finished, Dr. Strickland declared all 3 women healthy and fully capable of bearing children. He handed Edmund a written report, and the next phase of the plan began to unfold. To that effect, his first entry in what would later become a disturbingly extensive medical record. That same week, Samuel was moved from the slave quarters to a small cottage near the main house, a structure that had once been used to store tools. It was cleaned thoroughly and furnished with a bed, a table, and a lamp. He was given new clothes, better food, and treated with an unusual level of attention. Other enslaved workers began to notice these changes, whispering among themselves, wondering what favors Samuel had earned, what strange purpose he now served in the master's plans. The arrangements continued into late June. Edmund met with each of his daughters separately, assigning them specific dates. Catherine would go first in early July, followed by Margaret in mid-July, and Elizabeth in late July. He discussed the schedule as though he were organizing crop rotations, his tone cold, clinical, and detached. "You will each spend 3 consecutive nights with Samuel in the cottage," Edmund instructed. "Dr. Strickland will monitor your health throughout. If pregnancy does not occur after the first attempt, the process will be repeated the following month. This continues until all 3 of you are confirmed pregnant." The daughters listened in horrified silence. Their faint resistance was quickly crushed by their father's threats and the overwhelming power he held over every detail of their lives. On the evening of July 3rd, Catherine was escorted to the cottage by Edmund himself. He knocked on the door and ushered her inside without ceremony. Samuel stood by the window, his face tense with confusion and unease. He had not expected this. Not this pale, trembling young woman who looked at him with eyes filled with despair and resentment. Edmund left them there, posting an overseer named Virgil Haskell outside the cottage with strict orders to remain throughout the night. The message was unmistakable. No one would leave. No one would escape. What happened in that cottage over those 3 nights is not something we'll describe in detail. It is enough to say that 2 people were trapped in an impossible situation, forced into an intimacy neither wanted, both victims of Edmund's deliberate cruelty. Catherine's diary from those days, later destroyed by Edmund, was said to contain only a single phrase written again and again, "God forgive us all." By mid-August, all 3 daughters had completed their assigned nights with Samuel. Dr. Strickland visited weekly to perform his examinations. On September 2nd, he confirmed what Edmund had been waiting to hear. All 3 daughters were pregnant. Edmund reacted with grim satisfaction. He immediately isolated his daughters from outside contact, telling neighbors they were suffering from a delicate condition that required complete rest and privacy. The windows of their upstairs bedrooms were fitted with locks. On the outside, a nursemaid named Penny, an enslaved woman who had served the family for decades, was assigned to care for them full-time, bringing food, emptying chamber pots, and maintaining basic comfort, while ensuring they never left their rooms unaccompanied. Samuel, meanwhile, was sent back to field work but kept separate from the others. His cottage remained his residence, a visible reminder of his strange and privileged position. The other enslaved people began to avoid him, sensing that something about him was tainted, though they couldn't explain why. He had become a pariah without ever understanding his crime. Edmund spent his days meticulously planning for births, designing nursery spaces, making notes, calculating how soon his new workforce could begin its expansion. At night, he would sit in his study, writing in his secret journal, documenting every detail of his experiment with the pride of a man who believed himself on the brink of scientific greatness. None of them, not Edmund, not his daughters, not Samuel, realized that someone beyond the boundaries of Clearwater Plantation had begun to notice irregularities. Someone who would soon threaten everything Edmund had built. The summer of 1852 gave way to autumn and its familiar transformations. Cotton fields turned white with harvest. The unbearable heat eased into something merely oppressive. The social life of Hancock County stirred back to motion after the agricultural lull of late summer. It was during this season of renewal that Sheriff Thomas Brennan arrived in Sparta, the county seat, to assume his new position. Brennan was 34 years old, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, decorated for bravery yet disillusioned with the authority he once served. After returning to civilian life, he spent 2 years as a deputy sheriff in Wilmington, North Carolina, before applying for the open sheriff's position in Hancock County, a post that had unexpectedly become vacant when the previous sheriff died a heart attack in July. The county commissioners hired Brennan precisely because he was an outsider. Hancock County had long been known for its selective enforcement of laws, a comfortable arrangement between wealthy planters and local officials that ensured minimal interference in plantation affairs. Some commissioners wanted that tradition to continue. Others, a growing faction of merchants and smaller farmers, demanded real law enforcement. Brennan represented a compromise, experienced enough to be respected, yet unfamiliar enough to challenge the corruption that had taken root. He arrived in Sparta on September 15th, taking rooms above the courthouse. His first weeks were spent learning the lay of the land, meeting deputies, reviewing court records, and studying outstanding warrants. It didn't take him long to form impressions. The county was rich but divided, dominated by sprawling plantations that owned most of the land and wealth, while smaller farmers struggled to survive at the edges. The late sheriff had rarely set foot on the larger estates, treating them as private kingdoms. Brennan's military training had taught him patience, to observe before acting, to gather information before making a move. So he watched, he listened, he paid attention to which names kept resurfacing in conversation, which men wielded true power beyond their titles. One name appeared more than any other, Edmund Rutled. People spoke of him with a mix of respect and unease. Respect for his wealth, his influence, and unease for reasons they couldn't quite put into words. One night in late September, while speaking with a merchant named Hosea Grafton at a tavern, Brennan heard something that caught his attention. "Shame about those girls," Grafton said quietly, nursing a beer. "All three took sick at once, I heard. Been locked up in that big house for months now," he added. "What kind of sickness?" Brennan asked, keeping his tone casual. Grafton shrugged. "Rutledge says it's something delicate. Claims it's some kind of feminine trouble. Says they need privacy and bed rest. But it's strange, don't you think? All three of them at once, and no one's seen them since June." Brennan filed that comment away quietly. It might have meant nothing. Illness could sweep through families, and wealthy planters were notorious for guarding their personal affairs. Still, it was something to remember. His curiosity deepened in early October when he encountered Dr. Strickland by chance at the courthouse. The doctor was there to file death certificates. 2 enslaved workers from a plantation east of Sparta had supposedly died of fever. Routine paperwork, nothing out of the ordinary. Brennan was reviewing documents nearby when Strickland approached the clerk. But something about the doctor's behavior caught Brennan's eye. An anxious energy, a nervousness far too intense for a simple bureaucratic errand. When Strickland left, Brennan asked clerk about him. "Dr. Strickland? He's physician to several plantations," the clerk said. "Competent enough, but folks say he's got a gambling problem. Owes money all over Monroe County, from what I hear. He seemed troubled to you just now?" Brennan asked. The clerk thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, yes, jumpy, but doctors see a lot of death. Maybe it wears a man down." Brennan let the matter drop, at least outwardly, but the image of that nervous doctor stuck with him. A man unsettled by routine tasks rarely indicated anything innocent. Brennan had learned during the war that small irregularities often pointed toward larger truths. The connection between Rutledge and Strickland became clearer in late October. One afternoon, Brennan happened to ride past Clearwater Plantation and spotted Strickland's buggy traveling down the main road, clearly coming from the property. Acting on instinct, Brennan followed at a distance. Strickland stopped at a small office in Sparta, Judge Ketchum's private practice, separate from his courthouse duties. The doctor went inside and stayed for nearly an hour. Brennan waited across the street, pretending to examine his horse's shoes. When Strickland finally emerged, he looked even more agitated than before, wiping sweat from his face despite the crisp autumn air. Judge Ketchum stood in the doorway, watching him go, his expression somewhere between satisfaction and warning. Now Brennan had 3 connected pieces. Rutledge's daughter's mysterious isolation, a nervous doctor making regular visits to the plantation, and a judge meeting privately with that same doctor. Individually, each could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that deeply unsettled him. He began asking questions, carefully, discreetly. He spoke with merchants who supplied goods to Clearwater, with farmers whose land bordered Rutledge's property, with anyone who might have recent knowledge of the plantation. The information he gathered was conflicting. Some described Edmund Rutledge as a model planner, strict but fair, successful yet modest. Others hinted at something darker. Stories of enslaved people who would try to flee and were never heard from again. Punishments that went beyond even the usual brutality. A cold, detached cruelty that made people lower their voices when speaking his name. As for the daughters, every account agreed they hadn't been seen since early June. No church attendance, no social visits, no trips into Sparta. The explanation of illness satisfied most people, but few were skeptical. Those girls were healthy as horses in the spring. One elderly woman told Brennan after Sunday service, "I saw Catherine at Easter. She was perfectly fine. Then suddenly all three need bed rest for months? Doesn't sit right with me." That was enough for Brennan. He decided to visit Clearwater himself. He devised a pretext, a supposed inquiry about a wanted fugitive last seen in the area. And on November 3rd, he rode to the plantation. The approach to Clearwater was striking, a long avenue lined with ancient oaks leading to a grand two-story mansion of whitewashed brick, its wide verandas wrapped in ivy. The surrounding fields stretched far and wide, most already harvested, with enslaved workers burning the leftover stubble in slow, controlled fires that sent gray smoke curling into the autumn sky. An overseer met Brennan at the gate, a tall, grim man who introduced himself as Thaddeus Porter. "Sheriff Brennan." Porter said evenly, "What brings you Clearwater?" Brennan repeated his fabricated story about the fugitive slave. Porter listened without emotion, then shook his head. "Haven't seen anyone like that. We run a tight operation here. Mr. Rutledge doesn't tolerate runaways or fugitives on his land." "I'd still like to speak with Mr. Rutledge, if he's available," Brennan said. Porter hesitated, just for a moment. "Mr. Rutledge is occupied with family matters. I can pass along any official questions." "Family matters?" Brennan asked casually. "Nothing serious, I hope?" "His daughters are unwell. Requires his full attention," Porter replied stiffly. "I'm sorry to hear that," Brennan said politely. "Perhaps I could offer my respects. See if the family needs any assistance." "That won't be necessary," Porter said firmly. "Mr. Rutledge values his family's privacy during this difficult time." Brennan nodded, but his instincts were now roaring. The overseer's guarded tone, the deliberate obstruction, the vague references to illness, it all felt rehearsed, like a performance designed to keep people away. He thanked Porter and rode off down the road. But after a short distance, he turned off into the woods that bordered Clearwater's eastern boundary. From the concealment of the trees near the creek, he watched the plantation for more than an hour. He saw enslaved workers moving between buildings, smoke rising from the kitchen house. Everything seemed part of the normal rhythm of plantation life. But one detail stood out. Near the main house stood a small, separate cottage. Unlike the slave quarters, a man was stationed outside, doing nothing, just standing, watching, like a sentry. Brennan's unease hardened into suspicion. That evening, back in Sparta, he did something few sheriffs ever did. He unlocked the county records office after hours, letting himself in with the keys entrusted to his position. Under the dim glow of an oil lamp, he spent 3 hours poring over ledgers, deeds, and court documents, anything connected to Edmund Rutledge. What he uncovered painted a picture of a man both ruthless and methodical. Over the past decade, Rutledge had quietly absorbed 3 smaller neighboring farms, each acquisition wrapped in complex legal maneuvering that left no trace of coercion, yet carried the unmistakable scent of manipulation and control. Always through foreclosures, arrangements that, Brennan realized, Rutledge himself had engineered by extending credit to neighboring farmers, then abruptly calling in the debts. Each time, the court ruled in his favor, and Almost without exception, the presiding judge had been none other than Judge Ketchum. There were pages upon pages of records, slave purchases, cotton sales, tax receipts, all meticulously documented, all reflecting a man who left nothing to chance. Then Brennan found something that made him stop cold. A property transfer dated September 10th, 1852. It had been registered but not yet executed. The document transferred 20 acres of land near the Tennessee border from Edmund Rutled to a man named Samuel Frierson. The paper bore both Rutledge's and Ketchum's signatures, but was marked conditional upon fulfillment of terms to be determined. A promise of land to a slave. That was shocking enough on its own, but the timing of it, filed just after the daughter's sudden isolation, suggested a connection Brennan couldn't ignore. His mind began to race. What terms? What had this Samuel done or agreed to do to earn such an unprecedented promise? Searching further, Brennan found no bill of sale for Samuel, no purchase record at all. That meant the man had likely been born on the plantation. Another clue, and another reason to be suspicious. Brennan made careful notes, copied key details into his notebook, and replaced the documents exactly as he'd found them. Over the following 2 weeks, he turned his attention to Judge Ketchum. What he uncovered was even more troubling. The judge's personal wealth far exceeded what could be explained by his official salary. His name appeared on investment records for multiple plantations, Clearwater among them. He was known for consistently ruling in favor of planters, especially in cases involving disputes over enslaved labor. And, perhaps most telling of all, Ketchum and Rutledge were known to dine together frequently. Their relationship wasn't just professional, it was a partnership. Then, on November 20th, Brennan received a piece of information that pulled everything together. A local farmer named Amos Pruitt arrived at the sheriff's office, hat in hand, visibly nervous. "Sheriff," he began, "I don't know if this matters, but I think something's wrong over at Clearwater." Brennan gestured for him to sit. "Tell me what you've seen." Pruitt explained that his farm bordered Clearwater's northern edge. In late October, while hunting deer near the property line, he had heard screaming, a woman's voice, coming from the direction of the main house. Not a scream of fear exactly, Pruitt said slowly, but of pain or anguish. It only lasted a few seconds, then stopped. "I thought about going to check, but, well, Rutledge doesn't take kindly to trespassers, and I figured maybe it was a slave being punished. That's his business, not mine." "But you don't think it was a slave?" Brennan said quietly. Pruitt shook his head. "No, sir. That scream didn't sound like any Negro woman I've ever heard. It sounded educated, refined, like one of them Rutledge girls." Brennan felt a chill spread through him. Cold, absolute certainty. Something was deeply wrong at Clearwater. But what exactly, and how could he act without proof? He couldn't simply raid a respected planter's home on suspicion alone. Not in Georgia. He needed more, something from inside the plantation itself. That meant finding someone enslaved who was willing to talk. Dangerous work in a state where slaves could be whipped or killed for speaking against their masters, and where most sheriffs were more loyal to planters than to justice. Brennan began visiting the Saturday market in Sparta, where slaves were sometimes allowed to sell small goods or produce from their gardens. He watched the crowd carefully, hoping to spot someone from Clearwater who might speak with him privately. Weeks passed. Then, on December 7th, his patience was rewarded. He saw an older black woman selling eggs at a small stall. Another customer mentioned that she was from Clearwater. Brennan waited until she was alone, then approached quietly. "Those eggs look fresh," he said casually. "I'll take a dozen." As she counted them into his basket, he lowered his voice. "I'm Sheriff Brennan," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I'm concerned about the Rutledge daughters. Are they truly ill?" Her hands froze for the briefest moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Can't say, sir. Don't see them much." "But you've seen them," Brennan pressed gently. "They're alive?" A pause, then a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Are they being hurt? Held against their will? The woman finished counting the eggs. Her face remained blank, her voice steady. But as she handed him the basket, she leaned forward slightly and whispered 3 words, so faintly he almost missed them. Samuel's cottage nights. Then she straightened and walked away quickly, calling out her prices to new customers, leaving Brennan standing in the street with his basket and a phrase that could mean everything or nothing. By December, the rains came cold and heavy, soaking the red Georgia earth. Inside Clearwater, 3 young women remained locked in their rooms, their pregnancies advancing under Dr. Strickland's constant supervision. His weekly visits continued, each recorded in his growing set of clinical notes, pages filled with detached observations that barely concealed his moral unease. All 3 women were healthy. Deliveries were expected in late March or early April. Edmund Rutledge's satisfaction grew with every passing week. He spent hours refining his plans, selecting enslaved women to serve as wet nurses, designing nursery arrangements, outlining a curriculum for his future children that would begin at age 4. To him, everything was proceeding perfectly, but Samuel was coming undone. The promise of freedom that had kept him obedient through the summer now felt hollow. He had been returned to regular field work in September, though still isolated in his small cottage, no longer trusted by the enslaved community, yet never accepted by the white overseers. He existed in a kind of limbo, suspended between 2 worlds, waiting for a freedom that grew more distant by the day. In mid-December, desperation pushed him to make a mistake. While Edmund was inspecting the cotton storage barns, Samuel approached him directly. "Sir," he asked cautiously, "when will my freedom papers be prepared?" Edmund's face darkened. "The agreement specifies after the children are born and weaned. That means at least a year after birth. You'll receive your freedom in 1854, no sooner." "But the paper you showed me said—" "The paper said upon completion of terms." Edmund interrupted sharply. "I decide when those terms are complete. You be wise to remember your place. Samuel, you are still my property, and you'll remain so until I say otherwise." Samuel felt the trap close around him. The promise had been vague on purpose, crafted to secure his obedience without binding Edmund to any timeline. The master could delay forever, inventing new conditions as he pleased. That night, Samuel sat alone in his cottage, realization and despair twisting together in the flickering lamplight. And that's exactly how Edmund had planned to protect himself, by constructing a false legal shield that turned the enslaved victim into the supposed perpetrator. Brennan listened in silence, the lamp between them flickering, his pen scratching across the pages as Strickland spoke. Every new revelation layered horror upon horror, not only the crimes themselves, but the deliberate architecture of deceit behind them. When the doctor finally stopped speaking, his voice spent, Brennan closed a notebook slowly. "You understand what you've done," he said. Strickland nodded, eyes wet, his face drawn. "I was desperate. The debts. He said he'd ruin me, Sheriff. He said he'd expose me as a cheat. I didn't think." "You thought enough to keep records," Brennan said coldly. "That might save you. But from this point on, you're going to cooperate completely. You'll swear this statement before a magistrate, and you'll help me get those women out of that house." Strickland swallowed hard. If Edmund finds out, Brennan interrupted, "you'll have the law behind you for once. But only if you do exactly as I say." Outside, the rain had begun again, steady and cold, drumming against the porch roof. Brennan left Augusta before dawn, his coat soaked, the notebook wrapped in oilcloth inside his saddlebag. He knew he was running out of time. Once Edmund realized the walls were closing in, once Strickland failed to appear for his next visit, everything at Clearwater could disappear. The women, the records, the witnesses. By Christmas Eve, Brennan had secured an arrest warrant. Not for Edmund himself, not yet, but for a protective investigation based on evidence of unlawful confinement. It was a fragile legal pretext, one that would only hold if he moved quickly. He gathered 2 deputies he trusted, men who'd served under him in the war and owed their loyalty to him, not the local planters. They set out for Clearwater before dawn on December 26th. The sky was iron gray, the ground slick with recent rain. As they rode, Brennan reviewed Strickland's statement again and again, committing every word to memory. He knew it would be his only protection if the powerful families of Sparta turned on him. When they reached the plantation gates, the air felt unnaturally still. Smoke rose from a kitchen house, and somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck rhythmically on iron. Porter, the overseer, emerged to meet them, surprise quickly hardening into suspicion. "Sheriff, we weren't expecting visitors." Brennan dismounted slowly. "We're conducting an official inspection under authority of the county court." "On whose order?" "Mine," Brennan said. "Now step aside." Porter hesitated, then moved to block the gate. "Mr. Rutled doesn't allow strangers near the main house without his consent." Brennan met his eyes. "Then he can give it to me himself. Either you open that gate or I'll arrest you for obstruction." A tense silence hung for a moment, broken only by the horse's breath. Finally, Porter relented and unlatched the gate. Brennan and his men rode through. The great white house loomed ahead, its windows shuttered, its verandas empty. Somewhere inside, behind those walls, were 3 women, Edmund's daughters, and the truth that cost so many their peace, their freedom, their souls. Brennan swung down from his horse, hand resting on his revolver. "Let's finish this," he said. Would be blamed the perfect scapegoat, a fugitive rapist who had attacked his master's daughters and vanished into the swamps. Brennan knew that was exactly how Edmund would frame it. He couldn't wait for reinforcements. By the time he reached Milledgeville again, obtained new warrants, and returned, Clearwater will be silent. Every witness gone, every record burned, every victim buried. He left Sparta that same night, his shoulder bound and throbbing, carrying only a lantern, his revolver, and the signed confession from Dr. Strickland. The rain had turned to a fine mist that clung to his coat as he rode north toward Clearwater. The road was empty, the countryside drowned in fog. He avoided the main gate and cut through the woods, tethering his horse near the creek where he'd watched the plantation weeks earlier. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark except for one faint light in the upper story, the east wing, where he knew the daughters were kept. Brennan moved like a shadow through the wet grass, keeping low until he reached the back veranda. From inside came the muffled sound of movement, hurried footsteps, the dragging of something heavy. He eased open the door and stepped into the corridor. The house smelled of smoke. Somewhere deeper inside, fire crackled. He followed the sound until he reached the study. Edmund Rutled was there, standing before the hearth, calmly feeding papers into the flames, documents, letters, ledgers, each one curling and blackening in the heat. On the desk beside him sat a small pistol and a half-empty decanter of brandy. "Evening, Sheriff," Edmund said without turning. His voice was steady, composed, the voice of a man who had already accepted the outcome. "You're late. I was beginning to think the rain got you." Brennan raised his revolver. "Step away from the fire." Edmund glanced over his shoulder, smiling faintly. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You think the state will believe the word of a slave and a disgraced doctor over mine? Over Judge Ketchum's? You'll hang before I do." "The state will believe the evidence," Brennan said, though his voice trembled. "Strickland's confession, the records you're trying to destroy." Edmund laughed softly. "You mean these?" He tossed another handful of papers into the flames. "Affidavits, medical reports, all gone. Soon there'll be nothing left but ashes and rumors. You've risked your career for nothing." Brennan stepped forward, the heat of the fire washing over him. "Where are your daughters?" For the first time, Edmund hesitated, just a flicker, but Brennan saw it. "Upstairs," Edmund said finally. "Safe. For now." Brennan's finger tightened on the trigger. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, unlawful confinement, and assault." Edmund turned fully then, eyes blazing. "You think law applies here?" he hissed. "This is my land, my family, my blood. God himself gave me the right to order my house as I see fit. No man, no sheriff will tell me otherwise." The pistol on the desk flashed. Brennan dove sideways as a shot cracked through the room, shattering a lamp. His own revolver roared in reply. Edmund staggered backward, clutching his chest, a look of disbelief frozen on his face. He collapsed against the desk, scattering embers from the hearth across the carpet. Within seconds, the fire began to spread. Brennan rushed forward, kicking the burning papers away from the drapes, but it was too late. Flames licked up the walls, devouring shelves of books and ledgers. The air filled with smoke. He stumbled toward the staircase, calling out, "Catherine, Elizabeth, Mary." From upstairs came a faint cry, a woman's voice terrified. He climbed, each step a battle through heat and choking black air. At the top of the stairs, he found the hallway door bolted. He threw his shoulder against it until it splintered. Inside, 3 young women huddled near the window, pale and trembling, the smell of childbirth heavy in the air. 2 newborns lay in baskets beside them, wailing weakly. "It's all right," Brennan said, coughing. "You're safe now. We have to go." He carried the nearest infant in one arm and guided the eldest daughter with his free hand. The house behind them groaned as the roof timbers caught. By the time they reached the yard, the entire east wing was blazing like a torch. From the shadows near the slave quarters, figures emerged, Samuel among them, wide-eyed, his clothes soaked with rain. When he saw the women and children, something in him broke. He fell to his knees, covering his face. Brennan placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's over," he said, though he wasn't sure it was true. "It's finally over." Behind them, Clearwater burned until dawn, the house collapsing inward with a roar, taking with it the last of Edmund Rutled's secrets. But in the months to come, as trials began and testimonies spread through Georgia's courts, people would whisper that the fire had not destroyed everything, that somewhere in the ashes of Clearwater, a locked chest had survived, and inside it, documents written in Edmund's own hand. Plans or other plantations, other experiments, signed by names even higher than Ketchum's. And Sheriff Brennan would learn that justice, once stirred from its long sleep, could never again be easily silenced. Of all, the statement of the Rutled sisters themselves, each one recounting months of abuse, confinement, and forced treatments at their father's hands. The courtroom was silent as Catherine described how Edmund had justified everything as part of a medical experiment to purify bloodlines and erase moral weakness. When Margaret broke down describing the nights they were locked in separate rooms and forbidden to speak, even the court clerk averted his eyes. Edmund sat motionless throughout, expression calm, as if the testimony were about someone else entirely. Only once did he speak, rising during cross-examination to shout that the court had no right to interfere in matters of family discipline. The outburst sealed his fate. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On February 17, 1853, Edmund Rutled was found guilty on all counts: unlawful imprisonment, aggravated assault, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Because Georgia law at the time did not recognize his crimes as capital offenses, he was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Milledgeville State Penitentiary. Judge Ketchum resigned his post and fled the state before sentencing, but he was captured near Savannah 2 weeks later. His own trial revealed a network of officials bribed and coerced into silence: clerks, constables, even a deputy governor. Many were dismissed or imprisoned, though most received lenient treatment compared to the suffering they'd enabled. Dr. Strickland, whose confession had started it all, was found dead in his cell before he could testify further. The coroner listed the cause as suicide, but Brennan never believed it. Too many powerful men had reason to ensure Strickland's silence. As for Samuel, the state offered him conditional freedom in exchange for his cooperation. Brennan personally vouched for him, arranging work on a nearby farm under his protection. But Samuel refused. "I don't want freedom given," he said quietly. "I'll earn it myself." He disappeared soon after the trial, heading north. Some said he joined the Underground Railroad. Others claimed he was seen years later in Kansas, preaching to freedmen about the fire that burned the chains. The Rutled sisters were placed under the guardianship of a local church in Milledgeville. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, survived and were raised as orphans. Catherine, the eldest, later married a schoolteacher from Augusta. She never used her family name again. Sheriff Brennan stayed on for 3 more years, but the case had changed him. He was no longer the man who had once believed the law could fix everything. In 1856, he resigned without warning and vanished westward. Letters from that period suggest he joined a group of federal marshals pursuing slave traders into Indian territory. After that, he was never heard from again. Clearwater Plantation itself remained in ruins. Locals avoided the site, claiming to hear voices at night, the cries of the imprisoned daughters, the splash of a struggle in the creek. In 1870, a reconstruction crew unearthed a sealed chest among the ashes. Inside were fragments of burned ledgers and correspondence signed by men who'd once held office in the state legislature, proof that Edmund Rutled had not acted alone. The papers vanished soon after, confiscated for investigation by an unknown federal agent. No report was ever published. But sometimes in the Milledgeville archives, a curious researcher will find an old, water-stained folder labeled The Clearwater Case, 1853. Inside are just a few pages, Brennan's original arrest warrant, a partial transcript of the trial, and a single handwritten note at the bottom in faded ink. Justice is a fire. It spreads only when we dare to light it. Sheriff Thomas Brennan, 1853. Devastatingly detailed statements from Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth Rutled describe their father's threats, their forced isolation, and the meticulous, calculated nature of his plan. The defense argued that Edmund had been attempting to preserve his family legacy through unconventional but not illegal methods, that his daughters had initially consented before later regretting their choices, and that Samuel had willingly participated, accepting his promised freedom in exchange for cooperation. The trial lasted 9 days. Public opinion was deeply divided. Some saw Edmund as a monstrous figure who had violated his own daughters, while others viewed him as a desperate father trying to protect his heritage in an imperfect world. The fact that his victims were white women made prosecution possible. Had he committed the same acts against enslaved women, no trial would have occurred at all. On February 23rd, the jury returned guilty verdicts on charges of false imprisonment and conspiracy. They acquitted him of attempted murder, finding insufficient evidence that he had personally ordered the ambush of Sheriff Brennan or the attempt to drown Samuel. His overseers had acted independently. The defense successfully argued. Edmund was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. Judge Ketchum was convicted of judicial misconduct and conspiracy. He received an 8-year sentence and was permanently disbarred. Dr. Strickland, who had cooperated fully with the prosecution, received a suspended sentence and had his medical license revoked in Georgia. He relocated to Alabama and practiced under a different name. The 3 Rutled daughters gave birth in late March and early April of 1853. 2 boys and a girl, all healthy. Catherine's son was named Thomas, after the sheriff who had saved them. Margaret's daughter was named Hope. Elizabeth's son was named Samuel. The daughters face an agonizing choice: keep the children born from trauma or give them up. After lengthy deliberation, they decided to keep them. The children, being of mixed race in Georgia, faced limited futures and constant discrimination, yet they were also innocent of their grandfather's crimes. The daughters sold Clearwater. No one wished to retain the plantation after all that had transpired there. They relocated together to Charleston, living quietly, supporting one another, and raising the children as a collective family. They never married. The children grew up fully aware of their origins, knowing the complicated truth of how they had come to exist. Samuel was granted his freedom, along with financial compensation from the sale of Clearwater's assets. He moved to Ohio, worked as a carpenter, and lived peacefully until his death in 1891. He never spoke publicly about what happened at Clearwater, but kept the false deed Edmund had given him, a lingering reminder how promises from powerful men could serve as weapons as much as gifts. Sheriff Thomas Brennan continued serving as Hancock County Sheriff for another decade before retiring. His investigation into Edmund Rutled briefly brought him fame, though he found the attention uncomfortable. He had simply done what any lawman should: protect victims and prosecute criminals, regardless of their social standing. The fact that this was considered exceptional said more about Georgia's justice system than about his own character. Edmund Rutled died in prison in 1859 of pneumonia. He never expressed remorse for his actions. In his final letter to Catherine, he wrote, "I did what was necessary to preserve our family. History will judge me more kindly than this corrupt court has." Catherine burned the letter without responding. The case remained controversial for decades. Some historians later argued it represented the limits of patriarchal power finally being checked by law. Others noted that similar abuses continued on plantations throughout the South, unprosecuted and unreported, because victims were enslaved and had no access to justice. Edmund's crime was not unique, they argued, only his prosecution was. The 3 children grew up and eventually integrated into Northern society, as much as mixed-race individuals could in 19th century America. Thomas Rutled became a teacher in Ohio. Hope Rutled married a free black merchant and moved to Philadelphia. Samuel Rutled became a minister and civil rights advocate, dedicating his life to fighting the very system that had created him. Clearwater Plantation was eventually subdivided and sold to multiple buyers. The main house stood empty for years before burning down in 1867. Some said it was arson, others claimed lightning. Either way, no one mourned its destruction. The land returned to farming. The dark history gradually faded from memory, remembered only by those whose lives have been shattered by Edmund's ambition. Today, if you visit Hancock County and ask about the Rutled case, most people will have never heard of it. The records exist in state archives, buried among thousands of other legal cases from that era. Yet the story serves as a stark reminder of how power, unchecked and unquestioned, can transform ordinary cruelty into systematic horror. It demonstrates how institutions, courts, doctors, and local governments can become accomplices to evil when they prioritize wealth and status over justice. Edmund Rutled believed he was building a legacy. Instead, he destroyed his family and exposed the corruption that enabled his crimes. His name, once so desperately preserved, became synonymous with monstrosity. His grand experiment in heredity produced only trauma and loss. Perhaps that is the real lesson of Clearwater, that some legacies deserve to die, and that the people we enslave, whether by chains or by blood, will ultimately be the ones to tell the true story of who we were. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything Edmund Rutled did was fully exposed? Or could there have been even darker secrets buried at Clearwater? Leave your comment below with your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical horror stories like it, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode, and share this video with someone who appreciates the darkest corners of American history. Until next time, remember, the past is never as distant as we like to believe.